Court verdicts said certain proceedings involving residential surveillance are never made public, even when the subject is charged, such as those involved in suspected corruption, state secrets, national securities issue. The tally also misses those who, like Mr. Harper, are released without ever being charged. Now, Mr. Harper said he was detained after he came upon a violent fight between a couple and pushed the man to protect the woman. A few months into his detention, Mr. Harper was informed the man had lapsed into a coma and died. Now, a separate detention system for holding and interrogating members of the Communist Party works in much the same way. Another type of detention that holds the Uyghurs and other minorities in China, they're rounded up and put into internment camps that China government describes as vocational schools. Now, you may or may not have heard of the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs are a group of Muslim Chinese, and the Chinese aren't having any of that. I mean, any type of religion that's not sanctioned by the state is illegal, and they're putting these Uyghurs, these Muslims, into re-education camps and prisons that basically they're slave labor camps, which that's why stuff comes so cheaply out of China. Okay. And in a day when all sorts of people are trying to talk about the Palestinians and how Muslims throughout the world are being oppressed, which, by the way, is not untrue, especially in the case of the Uyghurs. They don't mention the Uyghurs. You never hear the Uyghurs mentioned. Now, often the only aspect of a suspect situation known to the outside world is a note to his family members from authorities saying the person is part of an investigation in an undisclosed location. That's it. Now, Mr. Harper said he didn't know where he was or even that there was a pandemic raging when he was in prison, and he was permitted occasional phone calls to the U.S. as well as visits from a lawyer and U.S. consular officials after his girlfriend tracked the location on his cell phone. He coped by exercising, praying, and hoping that one day he'd be aboard one of the jetliners he could hear flying overhead. Now, Beijing is a signatory to the U.S. human rights conventions with reservations. So, yeah, they're a member of it, kind of. In fact, in quotes, according to the Wall Street Journal story, the Chinese government believes that the principle of the universality of human rights must be respected, but the specific conditions of each country must also be taken into consideration. In other words, sure, we agree until we don't. Now, in 2016, China set what it termed as a human rights action plan that pledged limits on the residential surveillance measures, including controls on conditions and durations. I guess, in other words, it won't be forever because they didn't release the specifics on that. Now, some of China's highest profile prisoners have endured residential surveillance, including literary professor Li Xiaobo. Now, Mr. Liu, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010 while in a Chinese prison, died in the Chinese prison in 2017 at age 61. There's other Chinese artists and authors who have been put into those residential surveillance houses as well. In fact, 2 Canadians now awaiting trial verdicts were after being charged with endangering Chinese security, also spent time in the residential surveillance facility, Michael Coring and Michael Spaver. Now, most detainees aren't well known. They include lawyers who challenge government policy, members of the spiritual group Falun Gong, and Christians suspected of running underground churches, as well as regular run-of-the-mill criminal suspects. Mr. Harper, who stands 6'9" tall, he's a basketball player, remember, says he lost 40 pounds in detention after being fed paltry meals of sometimes bug-infested rice. Now, documents given to former detainees that they provide to safeguard defenders include an English language pamphlet that for rules that someone under residential surveillance need to, and I quote, "You have to sleep on your back and keep both arms above the blanket at all times." That's how they expect you to sleep. Nothing on your stomach, never on your side, always on your back. And all your arms have to be kept in view at all times. Now, human rights groups such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch for years have documented cases of residential surveillance. A Human Rights Watch report in 2009 found surveillance in black jails, in government ministry buildings, hotels, hostels, nursing homes, mental patient hospitals, drug rehabilitations, and even residential buildings. Now, following the G7 condemnation of arbitrary detention, which it didn't link to any one country, the Chinese embassy in Canada published a statement that criticized the language as nonsense and accused Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, a G7 participant, of ignoring the facts by using the summit to highlight cases of Mr. Coring and Mr. Spaver, the two Canadians in question. Now, the UN calls for enforced disappearance of human rights crimes and says the extra-legal technique has been used in 85 nations, including in wartime, and often a strategy to spread terror within the society. That's according to the UN, folks. A couple things on this. Why didn't we hear about this Jeff Harper? I mean, he was released in September of 2020. This Wall Street Journal story does but it was just released. I mean, I just read this week in the Wall Street Journal. I'd not heard of this. And he's a basketball player, okay? He's just an athlete. He's not a political guy. And the NBA defends the Chinese government to all ends because they want the money. And here's one of their own, not an NBA player, but a basketball player who was detained and for no reason, never charged, for 8 months, forced to eat bug-infested rice and sleep on his back with his hands showing at all times. You hear nothing out of the NBA. You hear no boycotts out of the NBA. And this government is ran by President Xi Jinping. And China is ran by the Communist Party. And if you disagree, even if you're in the Communist Party and you disagree with President Xi, you go to prison and you disappear. That, my friends, is inherently evil. Now, part 2 of this has to do, in a way, with global warming. This weekend is supposed to be 113 degrees in the Pacific Northwest. Normally, this time of year, it's about 70 degrees. So it's a lot hotter than it normally is. So the climate change people, the global warming people are saying, see, here's proof that we need to do more to combat climate change, to combat global warming. Maybe you agree with that. Maybe you don't. But one of the biggest things that contribute to global warming, or according to the people who say so, definitely one of the biggest things with carbon footprint are coal-fired power plants. And what have coal prices done recently? Well, they've climbed to their highest level in decades. Bear with me, people. I will link this to China, trust me. But coal prices have climbed to their highest level in a decade, making coal a hot commodity in a year when governments are pledging to reduce carbon emissions. Now, the prices for thermal coal, which plants burn to boil water into steam and spin turbines to generate electricity, have more than doubled in the past year as a result. More than doubled. Now, coal delivered into Northwest Europe earlier this month hit its highest price since 2011, climbing 64% this year. Prices for coal exported from Newcastle, Australia, most of which heads to other parts of Asia, but not China, have risen 56%, according to Argus Media. Now, both coal price benchmarks have outstripped gains in oil, copper, and other commodities that are benefiting from a vaccine-fired burst of economic activity. The upswing in fuel markets is contributing to higher electricity prices in the U.S. and in Europe. How can that be? If they're burning less coal, how can the prices be going up? Because of supply and demand, right? Bear with me. Now, prices are still expected to stay at elevated levels for at least several months, delivering a windfall for companies that held on to coal mines in the face of pressure from some investors to abandon them. Now, many commodities giants said they would eliminate their mines. Okay, the The BHP Group Limited, in contrast, said it's looking to exit thermal coal. Anglo America PLC spun off its South African coal business. So a lot of companies are just getting out of the coal business. So if coal is being shunned and more companies are getting out of it, why is the price of coal going up? Because, I mean, even China's going away from coal, right? Because remember, Trump was criticized for leaving the Paris Accord, while President Xi was going to make China carbon neutral by 2060, right? No, that's not the case at all. Now, supply is shrinking, but it's shrinking faster than demand. That's according to Tom Price, the head of commodity strategy at a think tank called Librium. Everybody has turned their backs on these thermal coal mining assets. Those companies that have clung on to them have made a small fortune on them in just the past few months. St. Louis-based Arch Coal, their stock price is up 103% in the past 12 months. St. Louis-based Peabody Coal, up 156% in the past year. Now, why is this the case? Higher prices in Asia, partially spurred by China's decision to bar Australian coal over Canberra's call for an international inquiry into origins of COVID-19, have drawn cargoes away from the Atlantic and towards the Pacific. If you remember this story, all Australia did, they said, look, we need to look deeper into this pandemic and how it started. It started in China. We need to look as to what the origins were all about. That's all they said. And China cut off coal imports from Australia. Now, Australia is still exporting all the coal they want, just to other countries. China's getting the coal from sources like us and Latin America. So it has to be shipped further around. So it costs more because you all know what's going on with logistics nowadays. Now, in the long run, analysts say the outlook for coal is still gloomy. In fact, leaders of the Group of Seven Summit this month said coal-fired power stations were the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions and pledged to double down on the efforts to cut back on the fuel. But for now, coal demand is back on the rise. And here is the caveat. Chinese import demand, meanwhile, has been boosted by a drought that knocked out hydropower generation in China. So, how could output in China be up if they're going to be carbon neutral by 2060? Here's part 2 of that story. And this is from Reuters, okay? This is not from InfoWars. This is from Reuters. And I also got the numbers that you're going to hear from many U.S. government websites, mainly the numbers for U.S. coal, U.S. power plants, U.S. fossil fuel plants, okay? Now, China has put an additional 38.4 gigawatts of new coal-fired capacity into operation. That was in 2020 alone. New coal-fired capacity. That's according to an international research center. That's more than 3 times the amount built anywhere else in the world. Now, China had won praise last year after President Xi Jinping pledged to make the country carbon neutral by 2060. They loved him for it. Remember, Trump was demonized for getting out of the Paris Accord, and Xi was lifted to a new level because he's going to make the country carbon neutral by 2060. But regulators have since come under fire for failing to properly control the coal power sector, okay? Now, including decommissions. So China has decommissioned some coal power plants, but including decommissions, China's coal-fired fleet capacity rose by a net 29.8 gigawatts in 2020. So the ones that they decommissioned were the ones that were inefficient. So even as the rest of the world made cuts of 17.2 gigawatts. So in 2020, China kicked it up almost 30 gigawatts of new coal plants, and the rest of the world made cuts by over 17 gigawatts. That's according to research by the Global Energy Monitor, GEM. That's a U.S. think tank and a Helsinki-based center on research called CREA, okay? And of those 17.2 gigawatts of reduction, virtually all of them have been made in the U.S. and the EU. Now, the runaway expansion of coal-fired power is driven by electricity companies and local government interests in maximizing investment spending. more than a real need for new capacity. That's according to Laura